So, thank you. I'm also a practitioner. I'm the head of communication of Opinion Festival. It's a festival where we try to put all together on two-day event. And by all together, I mean civil society organizations, public organizations like governmental, then politicians, media organizations, and also business organizations. And we try to put them together to discuss topics that are important in the society. And my question is, for you, like from a point of view of a practitioner, is also quite practical. You talked today about the theoretical need to create this bridge between policies and practitioners. And my question is more practical. How actually would you do this? So what are your recommendations? Maris already told us what are her recommendations, but what are your recommendations for both civil society organizations and government or policymakers? What are those first steps, let's say, in creating this dialogue to really become cooperative, not to become like in opposition to oneself?
That's a hard question. I mean, I agree very much that civil society is not just about institutions, about people and how you interact, locally. I mean, the flip side of one of the things I said that, I'm a bit libertarian, I don't want government doing things, is actually, I think that's partly because it's civil society that's best placed to figure out how people interact best locally. And I think government needs to be, states need to be a bit more deferent to civil society and how that can work. I think when things don't work very well in terms of funding and resourcing is when there's too many conditions on what that should look like, and I think it doesn't work. Civil society organizations should be allowed to pursue what they think works best based on the experience of local people, but that requires trust. So I think the other second thing I'll say, and I'll try to end really quickly on that, is that it can't just be a one-off interaction. So there has to be, I think, long-standing relationships between civil society and the state, and those have to be genuine.
Thank you. Rob?
Yeah, one thing that I wanted to go back to, thinking about how you create that space for that dialogue, is when you saw the debate between the politicians, and some of them were very open and said, look, once the elections are around, it's going to be very difficult. Because then politicians are always going to be tempted to seize on identity politics. We see it all across Europe. And what civil society could do is actually say, hey, look, you've mentioned that last time, just before the elections, these things always come up just before, then suddenly everything gets over-polarized. Now, I'm not going to say that you shouldn't politicize issues of identity and language, because of course they are political questions. The community has to decide on where it wants to go with these things, so it is political. But that doesn't mean that politicians should be encouraged to seize on it to divide the population. And I think that is one of the things that civil society can do, and I think you're hinting at it in your presentation, is you're a counterweight and say, no, we don't want any of this debate on the name of the street or where the statue should be placed or how the history book should be rewritten. We want to create a space where we can debate the actual practical questions that we face. The education system, citizenship matters, really issues that matter to people in their daily lives. Because what I've seen, unfortunately, in quite a lot of the OSCE participating states where I work, is that it's very tempting for politicians to seize on these things to detract from the bigger socioeconomic questions, from questions of corruption scandals, or questions that politicians don't want to talk about. Because talking about where a statue should be or what name the history book should have, like I see in some countries, they're very great at evoking emotions. They're very powerful. And before you know it, everybody will be speaking about this, rather than about these nitty-gritty issues that the government does need to solve. So I think that is my view on it. Civil society shouldn't fall for it, shouldn't go along with this politicization and say, no, back to the actual topic at hand. Yeah.
So still, in your opinion, it should be some kind of opposition. Like civil society should be in opposition to the government, like trying to be a guardian of democracy in the sense that you are still not trying to cooperate with government, but still you're trying to control them in some good sense. Do I understand?
Yeah, well, hold them to account. Control is maybe is too strong because we don't have democratic legitimacy, and I think it would be a problem if I was seen to be a puppeteer, as George Soros is in the sort of anti-Semitic things I'm seeing. But yeah, these are the values that a democracy says they all uphold. All the politicians will say they care about democracy and rights, etc. Sure. Are they doing it? And that's definitely our role. I mean, one of the reasons I said that is the UK example after the race directive was passed was trundled along, and I was sent to talk to various European countries, but I didn't see any bottom-up pressure. And when I was speaking in Lithuania about 10 years ago on gay rights, I found that without the bottom-up pressure, it was seen as a top-down implementation by the European Commission, frankly. And I do think that one of the reasons you need civil society is to have the support for rights and democracy, that otherwise politicians won't see any reason not to play into the emotions that, the dangerous stuff that we've just talked about.
Maris, do you agree with this perception?
But I do agree, but I think that that's why civil society needs quite a lot of empowerment.
Yeah.
We cannot just say that, well, it's up to civil society. Let them do the work. Let them bring out the data, statistics, talk to the community members, advocate for better rights. They actually need empowerment, and I don't just mean resources, like more funding, which is also needed, but more knowledge also. When there might be some politicians, there might be some civil society, there might be some government officials that can actually teach, give the knowledge, involved by themselves, and then show the example about how actually the values could be lived in the community, and how very simple decisions could be made based on the values of diversity and inclusion.
Susan?
Yes, so I think this is another issue where balance can be mentioned again, because civil society obviously is a very important, one important role of civil society is to hold governments accountable. And the same Guillermo O'Donnell I mentioned also wrote a piece about horizontal accountability, in which this is what he says, that's why you need this sphere, which obviously is not just the various kinds of networks and organizations, but also the behavior and exchange they mean. But at the same time, I agree completely with you that that's also what the research shows, that civil society needs recognition, it needs resources. And not only that, but governments should not just simply delegate their responsibility to these organizations.
Yeah, no.
Because there's a new, you're probably familiar with Lester Solomon's work, the Civil Society Nonprofit Index that they created at Johns Hopkins University, and the most recent publication that just came out in fall 2017. It's rather new, and I just skimmed it. But one of the striking findings, it's a comparative study a global study of civil society, nonprofit organizations, and similar to what Freedom House does for democracy indexing. It's quite impressive. And what they show, which was really remarkable, is the global strength of civil society, that this is really a massive presence, economically as well, and it needs to be better recognized. It needs to be also protected. So people elect government officials, representatives, politicians. They need to hold them responsible. They also need to tell them that they have to provide sustained support for this sector, if you want, or sphere, because otherwise it's always going to be these, running after one project, then applying for another project. So there's no sustainability otherwise. So it's, I guess, I don't know if that.
Well, people can die too. We see it in Grenfell Tower. This tower that's burned in London, and people died alive. The residents there were trying to tell the people in power that this was not suitable, accommodation. There was civil society on the ground, but nobody was listening to them. Yeah. And people, that you will see that. Maybe that is the most extreme case, people dying because of poor public health, but people are not living the lives that they should because government isn't being held to account. And so civil society is there. The danger of not having us supported, not just in terms of resource, but our voice, is conflict, is violence, is some citizens living less worthy lives. Yeah.
And there's about how policymakers at the local level, or officials, public administrators, city councilors work with civil society organizations and actors. On that question, there's another very interesting comparative study that was done by a young Canadian researcher comparing communities, two immigrant communities in Toronto, in the Greater Toronto area, and the same kinds of communities also in San Francisco and in that area. And because to see how the political and policy framework in which these communities are embedded, influences the way civil society organizations are able to provide for needs of those communities, and the differences are striking. In Toronto, because there is a multiculturalist approach to it, there is much more partnership. It's taken for granted that city-level officials have to be partners, have to listen to the needs, have to be involved in training and helping out and resourcing. And for this reason, they are better able to equalize within those communities. So the study involves Indian and Salvadoran immigrant communities. And in Toronto, there is much more equalization, socioeconomic equalization, than there is in the San Francisco area, where laissez-faire policy just leaves them to their own devices. So that means that those who come in already with higher educational and other resources are going to do much better. So anyway, so this is also, I guess, it reinforces, it's a qualitative data, but it's a significant one. It's based on extensive ethnographic research that shows how important policies are, the policy environment is, and the partnerships are.
Maybe we have some questions from the audience.
Thank you very much for your speeches and the high-quality discussion so far. One thing keeps puzzling my mind, however, is that when you have been talking about civil society, I have the feeling that you are talking about something that was developed in Europe, in the Western countries in the 19th century. It's the kind of a bourgeois public sphere with associations and organizations and their umbrella organizations. And this is, of course, still a very, very valid perspective. But we have now at hand also something more. We have all these online groups and communities and networks in Facebook and Twitter and so on. And in addition to the diversification of the society, we also have a diversification and increase of different forms of people interacting with each other. And I'd like to hear your comments on this. How do you see this kind of a virtual community development? Is it something that adds up to the let's say, traditional civil society? Is it replacing it somehow? Is it more a threat, or rather does it provide more opportunities in making all these societies more, let's say, integrated?
Maris, probably you?
Yes, I think all these communities that can be online, built online, they don't make the civil society or communities different. It's just another way of people interacting with each other. So for me, internet is just a tool. The communities and the groups that are formulated online, they might be different, but they are just another option. Of course, there might be some threats, the same way as there might be threats when too many people, maybe angry people, come to the streets, or there might be threats everywhere. But it's still an opportunity for many people who otherwise maybe cannot participate. They can now. It's an opportunity for many people to voice up. It's an opportunity for many groups to have the conversation about what are their needs, how to come to some kind of like mutual understanding. But of course, it needs maybe different skills now. organizing people needs a lot of skills. That's why empowerment is important. Now, if we have the internet, we do need different kinds of skills.
Thank you, Bob.
Yeah, I find it a particularly good question because we really struggle with that. Because how do you speak to a Twitter feed? How do you speak to these rapidly evolving communities that by the time I figured out where they are, they've renamed and they're something else again? And if there's one thing that we do learn is that the internet and Twitter do not necessarily make people more tolerant. In fact, the opposite is often the play. It's a free space for all kinds of things that I think polite people wouldn't normally say to each other in a polite conversation, but they do throw it on their Twitter feed. So we actually look at things like monitoring hate speech in social media. There's new forms of organization. What it, from a conflict analysis perspective, has given me is things move so much faster. Mobilization potential is enormous. When I was political advisor on Ukraine and I was trying to monitor the protests around Maidan and how quickly it can mobilize groups of people to the street, it is basically an accelerator, a catalyst on many things. Have these type of online communities coalesced in something that basically replaces or complements existing civil society in the traditional format that you described, yeah, an association with a board and annual meetings and things like that. No, it's something else, and we don't really have a good answer to it. But I think part of the answer lies in what you were saying at the start, Barish, that we think too much about civil society as this type of models, right? The NGO that is registered, that has a president, and all that. And civil society are also, let's be honest, not necessarily always the good guys. There could be quite negative civil society organizations, I meet them in my work, who have opinions that I wouldn't necessarily endorse being an OSCE official. But they are part of civil society. They deserve a place at the table. They deserve to say it if they stay within certain limits, at least. So you have to create also a space where they are allowed to join the conversation, because otherwise you get a level of frustration that goes back into these online communities. I'm from the Netherlands, and we have some debates online that newspapers finally decide to shut down the comment section because the things that are happening there are just, disproportionate compared to how people would have a conversation in a room. So I hope this answers at least part of your question.
Jean?
Yes, I'd like to respond to both issues that you raised. One of them is whether civil society it's a Western bourgeois kind of thing. And I think that it's very important for us to look at this in a more neutral, I guess, way, where we think of it as organizations that are between the state and individuals and families. And if you look up this global nonprofit index, you will see that there's a really significant density of it in China and all kinds of other societies. So this may be one of the myths that we need to maybe deconstruct. So I think that that's an important part of it. About these online groups, I've been also thinking about this off and on, that one reason why civil society networks form is the face-to-face exchange and interaction, where even though there is conflict and disagreement, even if people agree to disagree, they continue the conversation. So there's Ingrid Kerpel is a political theorist who defined toleration in those terms of keep holding both conflict and mutuality together. I really like that, because there is always conflict and disagreement. We don't necessarily want to be all the same shade of gray, right? But you continue the conversation. Like, I have a 16-year-old who challenges me all the time, but I always continue the conversation. And there are others too. And so these are the spaces that you were talking about, right? That creating spaces. Now, these online spaces are not real spaces. They are individuals who send in something, and sometimes they attack each other or something. It doesn't necessarily do that. So I don't know. I haven't actually processed those thoughts yet, but those are my comments. That I'm not sure they actually function in those ways.
Yes, I think it's the same issue that communities, they are very complex. We cannot just say that everything has a new thing. But I do support the idea that yes, we do have much more hate speech, which we need to work with. But we cannot say that because of that we need to close up all these other conversations. Because the good thing, positive thing was about it that we now have these groups openly discussing some of the things is that we know that there are people actually who have these values and this kind of beliefs. So we know that we have to work with it.
Yeah.
Amar, would you like to comment?
Yeah, no. This good. Well, the one thing I will think one thing. It also connects isolated minorities online. So I think disadvantaged groups who have had no voice, and this isn't just ethnic minorities, but maybe people who feel very unpopular in their school, who might even be feeling suicidal. So I think we shouldn't see it as all negative. Is one thing. And I think the other thing is I talked a bit about how we have multiple different ethnic groups in London. I think the way people engage online is also multiple. So there are multiple cleavages and multiple identities that people have, and they reflect that more often online than they do in person. So there is also an opportunity there. I get a lot of hate speech because we're very active on Twitter and a big profile, and I had to call the police last week about a threat on a colleague. So I'm under no illusion about the dangers, and I'm not trying to say it's all good. But there are, I think, opportunities, and especially if we're going to revitalize civil society for younger generations, we've got to figure out how to make use of the good.
Thank you. Thank you for your thoughts. Thank you for your presentations and for the discussion. Unfortunately, our time is up, so we have to finish.
Ladies and gentlemen, could we give our last panel a round of applause, please?
Thank you.